And joining us on the broadcast this evening, Yoshita Singh. She's a PTI correspondent. She's live with us from New York. Kanika Monga, she's the MD of Internal Medicine, joining us from Texas Medical Center in Houston. Yoshita, if I can come to you first at this point, we've seen some of the most horrifying visuals that we've been putting out on our screens of the protests that have erupted, 40 cities in curfew. What's the situation prevailing in the US this morning? It's early in the morning for you, I understand. What's the situation right now? And a tense calm in New York City is what we're told?
Yes, it's been like almost the 7th day now since the death of George Floyd, and the protests have only been increasing across cities. The National Guard is now being deployed in about 21 states. In New York, it's on standby. And the demonstrations, they usually start off peacefully, but by the end of the day, there are violent clashes with the police because sometimes there is looting, trash cans are set on fire, police cars are set on fire. So by the end of the day, whatever peaceful protests there are, some of them turn violent, and there have been a lot of arrests. So clearly there's a lot of anger and frustration among people here, but the police is also sort of hitting back, and they are stopping the violent protests. We've seen visuals of police officers taking a knee along with the protesters, trying to sort of ensure that there is peace, there is calm, extending a hand for a handshake and a hug. But there, in some instances, the protests have turned very violent. There have been arrests. In one of the states, a man was shot. So it's the start of a new week now, but we'll see how these protests go. And there's no sight that they will calm down. The protesters will calm down. They definitely want action. There's anger and frustration. There have been too many black deaths now at the hands of the police officers here. And I think people are just fed up. They've said enough is enough, and they're not slowing down now.
You know, Yoshita, we're going to come back to you and talk a little more about what instigated these protests, the reactions of the Trump administration. But we also have, Dr. Kanika Monga with us on the broadcast. And, Kanika, you've been with us on the show in the past, and we've spoken about, the kind of way in which the United States has responded to this pandemic, how difficult it has been for doctors like yourselves in hospitals battling COVID-19. When we see thousands of people out on the streets, a curfew that's been imposed across 40 cities, it's testament to just, how difficult the last 1 week has been in the US. Do you anticipate a second wave of infections as a result of thousands of people taking to the streets in protest?
Yeah, it's been definitely a very stressful time right now, completely heartbreaking. Definitely when so many people get together and there is a crowd, you always risk there being another wave of infection. The hope is that a lot of people that were infected initially stayed isolated, and hopefully that's flattened the curve now with everyone getting together for this. Again, do worry that there might be a second wave, but more than that, our hearts just really go out to the rage, to the people that are obviously undergoing so much inequality and mistreatment. So what's going on here with the backdrop of this pandemic was inevitable. You can't have society treat people based on color so unequally. And this isn't the first time this has happened. Really makes us worry and stress if this is this is what's recorded, what really happens behind closed doors.
Right. Kanika, we're going to come back to you and talk a little more about what the situation prevailing in several hospitals is at the moment. But Yoshita, if I can bring you back into the conversation, there has been a lot of criticism that has come against the Trump administration for instigating protesters. There hasn't been any action that has been taken which would calm the sentiment. But instead, calling protesters domestic terrorists has only made matters worse, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And New York Governor Andrew Cuomo yesterday, he said that, he was calling for calm. He asked for peaceful protests and not violence. And he said that if the protests turn violent, it only gives an opportunity to President Trump, who can then tweet about looting and not about the murder at the hands of a police officer. So clearly, people here, they want leadership from the White House. We saw that the exterior lights of the White House were dimmed. It was all dark outside, and it sends the kind of image that goes out that the White House is dark. The president is in an underground bunker in the White House, and while the city and the country outside is burning. And this is the time when you need leadership from President Trump, a call for calm, a call for unity. There have been cases where his advisors have asked him to address the nation, but I think that's been turned down. And just now we saw a tweet from the president, November 3rd, which he's referring to the election night in America. And he's still calling out Joe Biden. He's still lashing out at the Democrats. So that's not clearly helping the situation. Right now, the country is under fire, literally. From police cars to the church near White House is being set on fire. And the last thing you need is instigation and more hateful tweets from the president, and just a call for calm, because as you mentioned, that it's also the coronavirus pandemic here in the United States. America is still not out of the woods in that sense. And in New York, the cases have just started to come down now, and then to have all these thousands of protesters back again on the streets. It's been a very tough pandemic in the city. It's been the epicenter here. And the last thing, again, I think the state and the city administration need is a spike in the virus cases, which they've just managed to somehow bring down over a period of 2 months.
Well, absolutely. Yoshita, it's an extremely worrying picture that you're painting there. And, the administration hasn't really done much to help the situation. There have been provocative statements and tweets coming from the President of the United States. Dr. Kanika, if I can bring you back into the conversation, what's the general feeling among doctors? It's been a particularly difficult time for you and many other doctors like you battling COVID-19 on the front lines. But, seeing thousands of people out on the streets, violating social distancing norms. These are protests for an important cause, but they're also happening in the midst of a pandemic. Do you feel that the administration should have done much more, to control the situation?
Yeah, you can imagine, people are risking their life going out to protest. You can imagine the rage and how strongly they feel about this cause. My husband and I were both doctors. We watched the video, and it was something that was shattering, completely heartbreaking to see a life taken like that. Complete injustice. So if you can imagine all these people out there on the streets seeing themselves as that person in the video, worrying for their lives. Again, like I mentioned, this happens on a daily basis. This time it made headlines. It's been happening. We've seen it in the situation in New York City, Central Park with Amy Cooper, Chris Cooper. Innocent lives are being judged based on their color. So as a doctor, I do worry that social distancing is being disrupted. And of course, we've mentioned, there is that backdrop of the pandemic, but this is more serious than that at this point. If people are risking their lives, you can imagine the time is now. This is
people are risking their lives at the time of a pandemic. I think, Dr. Kanika, you put it really well. You can just imagine how angry people are to put their own lives in jeopardy and be out on the streets protesting for a cause that they so firmly believe in. Yoshita Singh and Dr. Kanika Monga for joining us on the broadcast this evening. Thank you very, very much.